Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Henry Estrada, and I'm the Exhibitions and Public Programs Director at the Smithsonian Latino Center here at the Smithsonian. And I want to welcome all of you to the fourth session and our last session for the day. We're going to go to a wonderful cocktail reception afterwards, so I hope you'll stay for that. This new facility, the installations are wonderful. I hope you had a chance to go up to the modern and contemporary galleries upstairs, one of my favorite places. It's a great place to lounge and to contemplate the art. It has a really wonderful lounge-like feeling as well. As I mentioned, we're going to have the reception at the Luce Center for American Art following this. And if you have a chance to walk to the stacks, it's quite an impressive place. First of all, let me just take a little time to thank a few people, and especially the Terra Foundation for providing major support for this important symposium and for underwriting the digitization of artist papers at the Archives of American Art. A resource, thank you. I know a lot of you in this room have used it and have been inspired by it, and now thousands of others around the world will have that opportunity as it becomes accessible online. So also on behalf of the Smithsonian Latino Center, I'd like to convey our appreciation for the great job that the folks at American Art have done with organizing this symposium. It's truly a diverse and fitting reflection. Thank you. It's truly a diverse and fitting reflection of our increasingly more expansive global art community. But this final session today will concentrate on places a little closer to home. We're going to take a hemispheric look at the art, both theory and practice, in what we call the Americas, as it circulates north-south axis or south-north axis, depending on what your perspective is or geocultural location is. I thought the title was maybe a little bit more appropriately should have been, rather than North American Crosscurrents, maybe Crosscurrents in the Americas. But our panel of speakers today will talk about circuits of exchange. They'll talk about influences. They'll talk about interrelationships between peoples and cultures, the art they make, and its reception and interpretation. Certainly one of the key issues surrounding this discussion about the movement of cultural capital and ideas across these territories is the notion of territories, boundaries, borders, as a framework for interpretation. Now, while many of the speakers at the symposium may talk about a porous, fluid, borderless space for the movement of culture and ideas, it still remains paradoxical that with the current anti-immigration sentiment, once again, we find that borders and nations are still very real concepts. So, how does the transnational artist and curator and critic respond to place? How does he or she find a sense of belonging, community? How do they deal with the here and the now and still move freely, fluidly, as a citizen of a global community? Our first speaker, Gabriel Pérez-Barreiro, who is the curator of Latin American art at the Blanton Museum of Art, University of Texas at Austin. They have just inaugurated a new facility, and along with it, a new paradigm for presenting the art of the Americas, integrating significant portions of its Latin American and American art collections. You'll hear from him. Following Gabrielle will be Frances Pohl. She is the Van der Zil Reynolds Professor of Humanities and Professor of Art History at Pomona College, Claremont. She has published extensively on 19th and 20th century art of Canada and the United States, written 2 books on Ben Shahn, and a textbook titled Framing America, A Social History of American Art, which integrates a continental approach to the study of art in the United States, including a coverage of New France and New Spain, as well as New England. She also examines in that book U.S. artists who have traveled to Mexico and Mexican artists who have worked in the United States. But today she's focusing on the cultural exchanges that have taken place between the United States and Canada, in particular in the last century. Our final speaker is well known to the Washington, D.C. community, Keith Morrison. He is the Dean of the Tyler School of Art at Temple University. He's a practicing artist who has exhibited extensively across the United States and abroad, and was selected to represent Jamaica at the 2001 Venice Biennale. His work is in many prestigious collections, including this one. He is a distinguished art critic and curator, and he'll speak to that today. He will also speak from his own personal experience as he addresses the evolution of transnationalism in art. So after we hear from our three speakers, I encourage you to share your comments and ask questions. We ask that you step up to the microphones and speak into the microphone so that our viewers online can also, hear what you're asking, what you're commenting. And we won't keep you too long. We are coming close to the cocktail hour. So I'll begin with the first speaker. Please welcome Gabriel Pérez-Barreiro.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Henry, for the introduction. And I'll add my, by now, redundant voice to the thanks to the organizers of the symposium, just with a slightly different note that, of course, I know Amelia from her time at curatorial intern at the University of Texas and at the Blanton Museum, and from where she's very sorely missed. So anytime you want to come and help us organize our symposia, just give me a call. Now, today I'll be presenting a more of a curatorial case study of how we've reworked the Blanton Museum's so-called American and so-called Latin American collections into a single installation that we've called American Americas on the occasion of the opening of our new building 5 months ago. Along the way, I hope that to raise some of the issues that have appeared several times today, and I'm sure yesterday too, but the focus will be, I think, much more on sort of museological issues, on how some of these debates that we've seen from an art historical perspective get translated into a three-dimensional physical space. Now, let me start with this iconic image by the American-Chilean artist Alfredo Jensen. It's not in our collection. His 1987 billboard project, A Logo for America, installed in Times Square in the heart of the quintessentially American and Latin American city that is New York, serves to remind us that neither a nation's borders nor its national symbols are the true containers or the limits of a specific culture. But just as the continental United States is not America, so there's no such place as Latin America, and I apologize profusely to Alfredo for this very cheap joke. Much less is there a culture that we can call Latin American. The term Latin America is rarely used in Brazil, Colombia, Bolivia, Mexico, or any other of the 21 entirely diverse countries it groups together. Latin America is most commonly used outside the region as an artificially constructed block defined in opposition to the places precisely where it's most used, being Europe and the United States. Therefore, we could argue that the very category of Latin America is one that only belongs as a construct, as a subgroup of American or European art history. Now, with the transformation of large parts of the United States into majority Hispanic populations, the issue of Latin American or Latino culture has never been higher on the political agenda, and therefore on the cultural one too. Now, there have been many responses to this. Most cultural organizations have started special initiatives for Latin American or Latino art. Now, while the experience of most US-based Latinos is of a complex and engaged dialogue with so-called American culture, most of these ventures present the opposite. They present an essentialized, isolated culture through at least three models. One is what I call the pyramids to Frida Kahlo model, the timeless, essentialized, magical world that's somewhere over there. The other one is the documentary photographs, the anthropological photographs of Latino lifestyles. And the other one is contemporary art from this imaginary country called Latin America. This country to which none of the target audience has ever been, because of course it doesn't exist outside the minds of US institutions and foundations, as a foreign wonderland somewhere far, far away, to which all Spanish-speaking and all dark-skinned people belong in some way. Of course, I'm exaggerating, but I'm not exaggerating. Even the New York Times likes to forget its geography, forget the issue of language we were talking about before. On the reopening of the Museum of Modern Art in New York, I guess about a year ago, and the final integration of their very significant Latin American collection to somewhat broaden and question the somewhat suprematist view that it had before. The point was entirely lost on, I think, on Holland Cutter, the critic of the New York Times, where, for example, where we have Joaquin Torres Garcia and Mondrian in the same gallery, he talks about the incorporation of the non-Western. Now, Torres Garcia was from Montevideo. I don't need to tell you, it's in fact, one of the most European cities in the American continent, and spent about as much time in New York as Piet Mondrian did. So what exactly is this non-Western? Just the same thing happens with, of course, Armando Reverón from Venezuela. Of course, the other favorite paradigm of the US press is what I call the Columbus syndrome, which is a constant rediscovery of Latin America. It happens about every 5 years. So this was 2003, so we're pretty much due for a new one soon. And this happens again and again. Now, in all of these cases, the approach is anthropologically populist. And the question is never raised about how these cultures might actually interrelate, how we might have to rethink our assumptions about internationalism and culture in new ways. Now, the issue behind all of these discussions is how we relate culture to place, as Henry said in the introductory comments. I would argue there are at least 4 entirely different kinds of geography: physical geography, political geography, economic geography, and cultural. Now, each of these creates its own maps, and the borders very rarely coincide. The visual arts in particular have always been mobile and permeable, and we've seen examples of that all day. And so to try to encase artistic production within the nation-state paradigm seems difficult at best and racist at worst. Now, in general terms, today there are 2 contrasting positions regarding the insertion of Latin American art into the US institutional context. One that emphasizes the difference in the identity of Latin American art in what would be an essentially political position, and another that rejects it entirely in favor of globalization in an essentially artist and market-led position. Now, I won't go into the origins or characteristics of each of these for lack of time. It's a very complicated debate. We could spend all day discussing it. But it does, to me, it raises a question if there's a third way between identity-based essentialism and Benetton-like neoliberal internationalism. Because clearly context is important in museum practice. Context is one of the many ways that we create meaning through the display of artworks. So how can we articulate this idea of context in a more accurate and in a more meaningful manner? The first question, I think, is largely one of terminology and the unit of context. In looking at the Blanton's modern and contemporary collections, which have traditionally been split into American and Latin American departments, I should note we have very little European modern or contemporary art, just for historical reasons. Both curators, and everything I'm presenting was in collaboration with my colleague, the curator of American art, Annette Carlozzi. We were both unhappy with the simplifications, not just in the term Latin American, but also in the term American. What constitutes an American artist? Now, in the contemporary moment, these definitions were already falling apart at the seams. So, for example, Fabian Marcacho, an artist born in Rosario, Argentina, been living in New York for the past 20 years or so, was acquired as part of the American collection. Administratively, this belongs in the American collection. In fact, it was purchased through the James Michener American Painting Endowment Fund, which is fine. I think that's absolutely appropriate. But obviously, he's someone who also belongs to Argentinian art history. So should he be classified American? Should he be classified Latin American? Should he be classified Latino? Of course, the answer is all of these and none of these at the same time. Similar case we have with Arturo Herrera, Venezuelan artist, lived in New York, now lives in Berlin, belongs in the American collection. And just to counter it from the Latin American collection, I recently purchased a work by the Russian-born, New York-based artist Anton Vidokli, whose work I think is a brilliant, they're stills from a video, comment on Mexican muralism and the tradition of abstraction. To me, that belongs in the Latin American collection, which is to say it doesn't belong anywhere. But these same issues, which I think in the contemporary world we're very used to dealing with this, most curators of contemporary art accept that the contemporary moment is a global moment. As soon as we moved back in the 20th century, it's not quite so clear, and in fact most collections continue to divide, most museums tend to continue to divide their collections this way. This is the floor plan of our new museum, opened just a few months ago, and this was the plan as it was in the original architectural scheme, which was a very remarkably generous in American terms presentation of Latin American art, but with a division down the middle, reflecting a world map in which there are two watertight halves, there are two art histories which don't touch. And of course, what happens is the American becomes a real art history, the Latin American becomes the identity department. That's an entirely different problem. But as we looked at our collections and looked at the specific works and where they were made and who made them and how they made them and what they were looking at when they made them, this division really began to make absolutely no sense. So we collectively made the decision to integrate our collections into a broadly chronological sequence with the collections fully integrated. So the same proportion, 50-50, just distributed in a very different way without a Latin American wing as such. Now that, I think, was already a move forward for our museum, but there was still the problem, if you put two works next to them, and one of them said it was American and one of them said it was Argentinian, inevitably there would be a difference in the reading of those pieces, particularly when the artist, for example, had lived in the United States for 30, 40 years, as was the case in many cases. So we went right to the very heart of the classification system. This is where museum people get excited, because we look at labels. It's always a favorite slide. And our labels, what you see on the left, is how we and most museums tend to classify their collections. I see here it's slightly different because it's a museum of American art. But here you have, for example, Paul Gauguin French with the scenes from Martinique. May ask a question, why did he produce them? Or the adjective down there, American. What you see on the right side is how we now classify our collections, which is to remove the national adjective. So there is no American, there is no Argentinian. And what we've done is shift the context, the unit of context, from nationality, from the single adjective, to the city. And so the city now becomes the very specific place in which culture is made. What that does is entirely redraw the map, the cultural map that we're talking about. And of course, it's the city plus the time. So we actually trace the major movements of the artist through the specific cities. So now Leon Ferrari is an artist who was born in Argentina, moved to Sao Paulo during the military dictatorship. This work was produced in Brazil. That's a very important piece of information, that the single adjective Argentina didn't give you that information. The same with César Paternoster. You can see this work from 1974 was produced in the city of New York. So suddenly its cultural geography changes radically. You haven't had to choose one over the other. You can connect him to Argentine traditions if you want to. You can also connect him to the New York scene in which he's working. So the idea is to expand, make more complex, and really connect these collections in ways that they hadn't been connected before. Here's just one example. As we were trying this out before we opened the museum, we did an exhibition of 1970s optical painting and found these two works which used to live in different collections, the work by Roy Comer and the work by Elme Mavigné. Mavigné is a Brazilian, Comer is an American. When you look at the specific biographies of these artists, you see that they both work together in Hamburg, Germany. So in fact, these works were produced when one was a professor of the other. So from being in two universes that never touched, belonging to two traditions had nothing. In fact, they belong to a third tradition, to a third place, which isn't even in the American continent, where there's a direct connection between them. This is a process that happened. Our entire collection was reconfigured through this very simple process. I'm just going to walk you through fairly quickly our new museum, and I apologize for the quality of all the photos. They're pretty bad. We open with this title, America, America, as a provocation, an attempt to think of what do we mean by America, to answer that first question. And actually, we start with a Torres Garcia painting, one that was actually painted in Paris. But surrounded by artists from the School of the South, the movement he founded in Montevideo in the 1930s. Here again, this is, even within Latin American art history, this gets rewritten, because this is typically a movement that's only described in terms of the city of Montevideo. What we have is a work produced in New York, we have work produced in Italy, we have a work produced in Uruguay. So even this, which used to be a national phenomenon, was very much, in fact, a global phenomenon, with artists working all over the world, even if their spiritual home was back in Uruguay. We transition out of this moment of artists rediscovering the pre-Columbian past and translating that into a contemporary language through to so-called American artists, Alfred Jensen on one side of the gallery and Louise Nevelson on the other. It was interesting to see upstairs in the museum here, they're both in the same gallery, although telling perhaps a slightly different story. In this case, of course, Jensen, who was born in Guatemala, there's now not this contradiction. He's one of many artists who are looking back to a pre-Columbian history. By the time we get to sort of the birth of the New York School, which is a great strength in our American collection, what we've done here is incorporate Siqueiros next to Rothko and Gorky. We don't have a Pollock, which of course is what we should have at this point. But here again, muralism and abstract expressionism typically presented as polar, not just in different collections, but as polar opposites in every possible way, which ignores the very real connection, particularly through the figure of Siqueiros and the very intense dialogue in this period between the United States and Mexico. So we've reintroduced that element of complexity, and in looking at the labels, you'll be able to see exactly the points where there are physical coincidences, and these artists are actually in the same place, which of course is simplifying. It's not to say they necessarily knew each other, but there's more of a chance that they share an intellectual context by the time you reduce it to a city. There's another gallery off to the side, which I don't have an image of, our paper gallery, where we do a very similar thing. We included the Tamayo we own, which was produced as part of the WPA program. We include Orozco's images of Harlem when he came to the United States and started his printmaking career. So you begin to trace that, in fact, these worlds that seem to be so far apart are connected in very intense and meaningful dialogues. I'll skip through some of the early 20th century, very similar points to be made, training in Europe and bringing ideas of modernity onto the American continent. Let me skip through. Now, this moment down here, particularly the lower image, is where we sort of look at minimalism and its relationship to painting. And we have two new acquisitions here. The first work you're looking at is by Alejandro Puente, entirely unknown artist in the American context. It's a work from 1966, produced in halfway between the city of Buenos Aires and La Plata, in an entirely contemporary language. So this work, I think, deeply challenges the idea that minimalism only occurred in the city of New York in 1966. It was also happening in different parts of the American continent. As is the case with César Paternoster, the next image down, it's the label we looked at before, an artist who at this point is living in New York City, alongside Joubert, who is the next image. In fact, the two of them famously held simultaneous exhibitions in January of 1970 in New York City. Joubert immediately making it to the cover of Art Forum, and Paternoster going into absolute oblivion. And then Bryce Marden, you can just see the corner of. So if nothing else, this sequence, at least I think, challenges, by placing some very familiar names with some entirely unfamiliar names, placing them in a different kind of geographical relationship to each other. I think it at least asks the question, asks us to challenge our assumptions of where some of these moments in art history actually happened and who were the people who actually made them happen. Some of the moments are more whimsical, as in this one, Valtercio Caldas in opposition to Carl Andre. This is less to do with us sharing a moment of history and more to do with relative interpretations of each other's intention. In our moments of the great sort of rediscovery of figuration in the 1970s in response to great social and political themes, we have De la Vega, but painting in New York. We have Peter Saul, we have Antonio Hicamara, Antonio Berni, Luis Jimenez. So we're really mixing up to show that in many ways, so many artists all around the globe, certainly, but certainly around the Americas, were looking at the big social issues of the day and recovering the figure through painting in ways that, at very least, are worthy of comparison. And then something very similar with political conceptualism, where we have works by Luis Kamnitzer, of course, a Uruguayan artist who's lived now for something like 40 years in the United States. His Uruguayan Torture series, a series that could only have been produced in exile. I mean, the exile is very much part of the content of the piece, but placed in dialogue with Vito Acconci. These are dialogues that are never allowed to happen. And Celia Munoz, a Texas-based Latina artist. You can just see the corner of the piece there. Eugenio Didborn, artist in Chile. So it's, again, trying to trace a much more complicated cultural geography around these works. The installation continued on the ground floor with a full display of our contemporary collection, the Marcacho we saw before, Pablo Siquier, contemporary painter from Argentina, with a contemporary artist from Texas, Trendoya Hancock, artist from Brooklyn in the middle. So by this point, as I say, these works are in dialogue much more about the the languages, the intentions of the piece, the many correspondences that they can have across time and space. Josefina Glisasti from Chile, Rachel Harrison from New York. And one of the things is also introducing artists who perhaps this is the first presentation of their work in the United States, often outside their own country of origin, as would be the case of Josefina Glisasti, next to artists who are very well known and consolidated at this point, for example, Byron Kim or Rachel Harrison in this particular image. Again, we have Liliana Porter from Argentina, New York, with Robin O'Neill, a younger artist from Houston. I could walk through all. Each of these represents a very different set of dialogues, a very specific set of dialogues that have much more to do with the piece and have much less to do with trying to categorize work from a particular region together, which inevitably ends out essentializing and, in worst case, stereotyping the production from a particular region. Now, to me, what was interesting or provocative about this process was not just what it did in terms of the insertion of Latin American art into an American mainstream history. To me, what was very interesting is that it required, on the American art side, also a re-questioning and a redefinition of some of the assumptions behind American art history. And so for me, that reciprocity and the fact that what we really tried to do was come up with an entirely new system of classification, a new unit of context that would apply equally across both collections and would disrupt the readings of both collections. If it disrupts a conventional reading of American art history, and you're better qualified to say that than I am, it certainly does disrupt also conventional readings of Latin American art history very deeply. All kinds of assumptions that exist in our own academic knowledge, which by seeing works placed in different juxtapositions and different contexts create an entirely different map for us to consider. So thank you very much for your patience.
The American journalist Andrew Malcolm, after having spent several years in Canada as Canadian bureau chief for the New York Times, described the country as follows, and I quote, "It sits atop the Western Hemisphere, a brooding geographic colossus, immense, hostile, forbidding, and unforgiving of those who ignore its natural rules of survival. Scattered across this area like a few specks of pepper on a huge freezer room floor are the people, huddling together in cultural colossus, ever and always threatening to swallow us up whole, our natural resources, our markets, our airwaves. The relationship between the United States and Canada has always been vexed. With the successful conclusion of the American Revolution, tens of thousands of those loyal to the British Crown fled north, to a territory much of which had only very recently come under British control with the defeat of the French in 1760 and the signing of the Treaty of Paris in 1763. Of the same stock as the Americans who led the revolution, these loyalists distinguished themselves from the citizens of the emerging nation to the south by promoting, among other things, strong anti-American sentiments. As the US grew into a major continental and then international power, Canada was forced to engage in a series of complicated diplomatic maneuvers in order to maintain its political, economic, and cultural independence while not alienating or unduly aggravating the elephant on its doorstep. One of the results of this is that we Canadians have gotten to know a great deal about our neighbor to the south. The same cannot be said, however, about Americans. What little is known about Canada in the US is gleaned primarily from the mass media, be it television coverage of Canadian hockey games, this one against the Soviets in 1972, you can see Canada winning here, movies about the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, or magazine articles about the move of the federal government to decriminalize the use of small amounts of marijuana and to legalize gay marriage, making us, even in the eyes of the stodgy economist, cool. And here I might suggest that my moose is bigger than Margaretta's moose. Few Americans are aware, however, that Canada is the US's largest trading partner, that it contains 30% of the world's fresh water supply, has the second largest oil reserves next to Saudi Arabia, and shares the longest contiguous border of any two countries in the world. These facts have, however, begun to draw the attention of Americans as news media report on the concerns of the US government over China's investment in Alberta's oil sands and over the securing of that long, porous Canadian border against terrorists. These concerns will undoubtedly become even more significant in a world marked by increasing violence, shrinking oil supplies, and global warming. Reason enough to re-examine the relationship between the United States and Canada. This relationship has not been totally ignored within American institutions of higher education. In the field of art history, there have been several attempts to think across national borders on the North American continent. Insights from the field of border studies, which is best known for the attention it has drawn to the US-Mexico border, are now also being applied to the US-Canada border. In fact, some have argued that almost all of Canada is a border culture, as almost all of the country's population lives within 150 miles of the US border. Others have focused on regional histories, claiming, for example, that the Pacific Northwest, British Columbia, Washington, Oregon, and Alaska, is more of a cultural and economic unit than BC, Manitoba, and Nova Scotia, or Washington, Ohio, and Delaware. Canadian art is still, however, most often seen in this country as provincial, when it is noticed at all. If asked to describe the relationship between the art of Canada and the United States, most art historians and critics would respond that the US has influenced Canada, that Canadian artists have consistently looked south, always south, for inspiration. Through exhibitions of American artists, visiting artists and critics, art publications, or trips to the United States, Canadian artists have been exposed to and influenced by the leading artists of the major American urban centers. Yet, did the influence ever flow in the other direction? Did American artists look north for ideas or inspiration? If so, were these ideas based on the material reality of Canadian geography and culture, or on the myths and stereotypes? One of the most powerful images of Canada in the US is reiterated in the quote by Andrew Malcolm with which I opened this paper. It is an immense, often breathtakingly beautiful, cold, and sparsely populated land, an image promoted in the majority of Hollywood movies set in Canada. And there were actually over 575 movies set in Canada before 1970. A second widespread image of Canada can be found in Michael Moore's film, Bowling for Columbine, where the country is seen as less violent, less racist, and more politically progressive overall than the US. There is much that is true in these representations, but there is also much that is left unacknowledged. For example, Canada's vaunted socialized medicine, one of the mainstays of its progressive reputation, did not appear at the national level until the 1960s. In addition, Canada did not always welcome immigrants from outside of Northern Europe. In 1928, Fred Hauser, a strong supporter of the painters known as the Group of Seven, and this is Lauren Harris's Lake Superior of 1922, Hauser, who supported the Group of Seven, artists who celebrated the vast, unpeopled expanses of Canada's northern terrain, published an article defending the country's restrictive immigration policy. He noted that one of Canada's important roles was to, quote, feed special food to the United States in the form of the best Canadian minds who would go south to offset the negative spiritual effect of the influx of immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe. According to Hauser, if such an influx had hit Canada, the splendid loneliness of the northern land would have been lost. Sometimes the best, or at least some of the most creative minds in the US came north. And in the time I have left, I would like to look briefly at two American artists who did so, at why they went north, and how their experiences might help us arrive at a more nuanced understanding of the relationship between the United States and Canada. In 1989, the Canadian art historian John O'Brien published an essay entitled, "Where the Hell is Saskatchewan, and Who is Emma Lake?" And here is Bernard Newman, and Emma Lake is in northern Saskatchewan, and I don't see the pointer here, halfway up, and if that can be focused a little bit, you might be able to see it. halfway up the province. The title question was posed by Barnett Newman in the late 1950s, and O'Brien notes that for the joke to have worked in Newman's New York circle, people would have to have already known something about Saskatchewan and the Emma Lake artists' workshops. O'Brien wanted to find out exactly what that something was, or, quote, why a number of artists and critics in New York cared at all about Saskatchewan, or about a small, unpretentious workshop for professional artists on the shores of a shallow, reedy lake to the north and a little bit west of Prince Albert, end of quotes. After all, Emma Lake was not Giverny. One of the main reasons Americans knew about Saskatchewan in the 1950s was the election in 1944 of a socialist government, the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation, led by Tommy Douglas. The CCF stayed in power in Saskatchewan until 1964. This election was covered widely in the US. Let me give you a CCF billboard. This election was covered widely in the US press, both mainstream and left. What was particularly intriguing for American reporters was that a primarily rural province of landowning farmers, rather than an urban industrial region, supported such a political move. The Saskatchewan government was thus presented as a unique event, and the coverage of its goings-on through the late 1940s and 1950s in the US press during the height of the Cold War ensured that many Americans were aware of this geographically remote province. Among them was Barnett Newman. Although by the end of the 1950s, Newman had severed his earlier connections with leftist political groups, he still maintained leftist sympathies, sympathies that, according to O'Brien, would have predisposed him favorably toward accepting an invitation to visit Canada's Red Province in 1959. He may also have been attracted by the myth of the North as a retreat from an emasculating urban modernity, a place where he could reinvigorate his manhood. Yet there were other more obvious reasons why Newman might have accepted an invitation to visit Emma Lake. He was paid a considerable honorarium for the time, plus travel, room, and board, all of which was provided by the Saskatchewan Arts Board, the first government-funded arts council of its kind in North America. The board was established in 1948, 10 years before the Canada Council, which was the federal arts organization. Its first arts workshop was funded in 1950 in the area of drama. And this workshop was directed by Florence James, an American social reformer who was blacklisted by the Washington State Committee on Un-American Activities. James moved to Saskatchewan permanently in 1953. By inviting New York artists and critics to their workshop, Saskatchewan artists were actually bucking the trend at the federal level to engage in cultural protectionism against the US. Many in Saskatchewan saw such protectionism as dangerous isolationism. What was necessary for them was more contact with the best of American high culture, which included Barnett Newman. Arthur McKay, one of the artists who organized the Emma Lake workshops, wrote in 1964, quote, "Curiously enough, we accept political coercion, economic domination, Coca-Cola, and predigested mass communication, while we resist exposure to the more humane and civilized arts from the USA," end of quote. Despite this resistance from the Saskatchewan arts community, Canadian cultural protectionism expanded in the following decades. By 1971, Canadian radio stations were required to play Canadian music for at least 30% of the duration of their music broadcast, and Canadian television to have Canadian programming for 60% of the time between 6 p.m. and midnight. In 1985, legislation was passed making it illegal for foreign companies to own Canadian publishing houses. While such protectionism eased in the 1990s, this ad from a 2002 issue of the Beaver, the Canadian History magazine, suggests that cultural nationalism is still alive and well. And if you can read there, it says, it's not the same if it's not Canadian. One of my students asked if there was any significance to the fact that the dogs are French poodles. And we'll maybe talk about French and English Canada in the discussion section. So no amount of legislation, however, could prevent the continued domination of the Canadian economy by American interests, nor Canada's increasing participation in a complicated global capitalist marketplace. It was this economic reality that informed a series of photographs taken by the American photographer Alan Sekula in 1985-86, titled Geography Lesson, Canadian Notes. In his introductory series, Sekula, in introducing the series of photographs, Sekula writes, quote, "For citizens of the United States, Canada is typically neither here nor there. Canada occupies a zone of conceptual indifference, unthought, insignificant, simultaneously the same and different, but in ways that do not seem to matter much in an American scheme of things," unquote. Sekula wanted to counter this indifference and to point out that Canada might, in fact, matter in the American scheme of things. He began his project with a look at one of the most visible reminders to American visitors that they are in a foreign country, Canadian currency. And I quote him, "If money is peculiar," he writes, "simultaneously abstract and concrete, what is especially peculiar about Canadian money? What mysteries lurk in these innocent and optimistic engravings depicting a productive, industrialized nature? How is this imagery repeated in an official architecture of Canadian finance and within the productive and not so productive landscape itself?" Sekula attempts to answer these questions through a series of photographs and written text that center on two cities in Ontario, Ottawa, the federal capital, and Sudbury, the site at the time of the largest nickel mining and smelting complex in the world. And Ottawa is right here, and Sudbury, yeah, it's over here somewhere. Maybe it's off the map. Sudbury's often off the map, conceptually, but it's over this way somewhere. So he's looking at Ottawa and Sudbury. In particular, he's looking at the Bank of Canada, designed by Arthur Erickson and completed in 1979, and that's the glass structure with a concrete block in the middle, and I'll give you a better slide in a moment. And in Sudbury, at the operations of the Canadian multinational firm Inco, formerly the International Nickel Company of Canada, which has subsidiaries in Indonesia, Guatemala, and the US. The original Bank of Canada building, it's right here, completed in 1938, and that's the block in the middle, has been embedded in the new structure, as if, writes Sekula, quote, "a brick had been frozen halfway into a block of ice." Located across the street from the Parliament buildings, its reflective glass surface literally and figuratively reflects the relationship between capital and government. The building itself is both open and closed to the public. People are free to enter the lobby, which is filled with tropical plants and a large stone from the island of Yap in the South Pacific, while the wealth of the nation is safely tucked away in underground vaults. The present is embedded in the past, with the Yap stone, an ancient form of currency, on one side of the lobby and a currency museum on the other. At the same time, the lobby's landscape reinforces the connection between wealth and nature. Canadians are very familiar with the celebration of the natural wealth of our country. Some revel in the images of the Group of Seven, of the rich but windswept terrain with pine trees, stand-ins for Canadians themselves, clinging tenaciously to the cliffs. Others foreground the extent to which Canada's rich natural resources have made it, in the words of Canadian economist Leo Panitch, a, quote, "rich dependency, possessing a branch plant economy dominated by American multinationals," unquote. While Sudbury is a source of much mineral wealth, it is a far cry from Ottawa or from the lush tropical lobby of the Bank of Canada or the paintings of the Group of Seven. Sekula reveals three secrets about Sudbury. First, it is not a landscape. Despite the scenic outlook sign, Years of roasting nickel ore over open fires have destroyed the region's agricultural economy and defoliated the surrounding territory. Sudbury also contains a large object symbolic of currency, yet much less romantic and less historical. It is not an ancient yapstone, but a giant Canadian nickel. This large nickel suggests that the wealth from the mines is Canadian, and yet this is not totally the case. The second secret about Sudbury is that Inco is not really a Canadian company. In 1902, the newly consolidated steel industry, directed by J.P. Morgan, formed the International Nickel Company. Originally incorporated in New Jersey, International Nickel only became a Canadian company in 1928 in order to avoid antitrust action in the United States. By 1977, Canadian ownership of Inco stock was running at 30%, with over 50% of stock ownership residing in the United States. In 1976, as Ericsson was beginning work on the Bank of Canada, the company changed its name to Inco, mechanized much of its operations, and moved the more labor-intensive jobs to third world countries. In 1969, the company employed 18,000 workers. In 1986, it employed 6,500. Sudbury's third secret is that Canadian unions are not Canadian. Canada is unique, argues labor historian Jack Scott, in that it is the only country in the world with unions whose headquarters are located in a foreign country. Unions which at the same time are subject to the laws and labor legislation in the country where the headquarters are situated. Most Sudbury workers belonged in the early 1980s to the United Steelworkers of America. Yet one small local of 2,000 workers were still represented by an earlier, more radical and militant union, mine, mill, and smelter workers. Mine Mill, founded in the 1930s and affiliated with the newly formed Congress of Industrial Organizations, was expelled from the CIO during the anti-communist purges of the 1950s. Sekula notes that Canadian workers in the early 1980s were twice as likely as Americans to belong to unions, which still holds true today. And those workers were also becoming increasingly militant and independent from their American internationals, one recent example at the time being the secession of the Canadian United Auto Workers. For Sekula, this union independence in the North provided dissident American unionists with a valuable example to follow in their own struggles to transform undemocratic unions and to expand the unionized labor force in the US. Learning about Canada provided much more for Americans, therefore, than simply a lesson in geography. Saskatchewan has been back in the news again lately. In an episode of the last season of 6 Feet Under, Vanessa, Rico's wife, Rico's one of the owners of the funeral home, Vanessa hires a young woman from Saskatchewan to be a housekeeper or babysitter. When Vanessa comes home to find the woman making pancakes for a homeless person, she berates the girl, yelling, "You can't do this. Where do you think you are, Canada?" While viewers might not have gotten the reference to Saskatchewan, they certainly would have gotten the joke about Canada. And Kiefer Sutherland, who won this year's Emmy for Outstanding Lead Actor in a Drama Series, is the grandson of CCF leader of Saskatchewan, Tommy Douglas. Sutherland plays counterterrorism agent Jack Bauer in the TV series 24, a fitting 21st century version of the Canadian Mountie who always gets his man. Yet the image of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police has become tarnished of late, and the relationship between the US and Canada strained over the case of Maher Arar, a Syrian-born Canadian citizen detained at JFK Airport in September of 2002 on his way home to Canada, an action based in part on inaccurate information sent to the US authorities by the RCMP. He was held in solitary confinement, labeled a member of Al-Qaeda, and sent to Syria, not Canada, a decision made without the involvement of the Canadian government, where he was imprisoned and tortured for a year. Once released, no charges were made against him by Syria, the US, or Canada. This is a map of Canada and, well, actually of North America, which, if we can get it focused, does not show any of the political borders. It's based on population distribution to kind of help us rethink the relationship between the three countries. Adam Gopnik convincingly argued yesterday that Americans come to understand their distinctiveness as Americans through direct encounters with other cultures. At the same time, through such encounters, they come to see certain basic commonalities that exist across cultural differences. Barnett Newman didn't make any art during his time at Emma Lake. Instead, he engaged in conversations with his Canadian hosts about their work and about the exploits of the abstract expressionists, often over a bottle of vodka. Perhaps they also talked about the CCF and the Saskatchewan Art Board. According to John O'Brien, this was the most important aspect of Newman's visit. In perhaps coming to understand himself better as an American, he provided an opportunity for his hosts to see themselves as a more cohesive community, one both distinct from yet connected to the contemporary art world of New York. This visit argued against cultural protectionism and national parochialism and for free and open exchanges, which means, among other things, being able to travel between two countries without fear of deportation to a third. The visit was a mutual geography lesson, a rich feast made up of the special cultural food from both sides of the border. Thank you.
I'm to press right when I'm ready to go. I thought I'd use my cell phone to time myself. Don't worry, it's not on. Although I've always wanted to give a talk to like a group like this and get a phone call and take it and then say to somebody in the audience, it's for you. It's a great thing. Anyway, I don't think today is one such day. Henry asked me to, well, in trying to prepare this talk, I was somewhat frustrated with myself, thinking that I wanted to talk about issues and ideas among people of African descent, African Americans and people of African descent worldwide, but recognized certainly that in 20 minutes I couldn't do that. And even more so, perhaps, I couldn't do that if I had 2 hours or 3 hours, not because of the catalog of things that people do, but because Africanness, in all its implications, has become so complex that years ago I decided I just couldn't figure out how to do that comprehensively anymore. I had done that for years. In fact, I think the last time I did that was for a forward to a Smithsonian book. But after that, I decided, I just can't do this anymore because it means so many things, and it's so incredibly complex in good and bad ways, but perhaps more so in good ways. And so I thought the best thing to do was to talk about aspects of my own work in which Africanness surfaces by way of example to you. I'm going to show you relatively few slides because I am perhaps less interested in focusing on my own work as such, but more so on certain characteristics, certain issues in my work, which I perceive to be common to that of many African artists, artists of African descent. Now, I should say many, but by no means all. I mean, there are people who are absolutely not interested in anything that I do. And there are many different kinds of ideas among artists of African descent as there are perhaps people. But I want to give you a glimpse, a modest one perhaps, from my own perspective. And indeed, I know artists who do it better than I do. But I'm the one you've got. I'm the one you're stuck with. So that's what you got to look at. Henry asked me to mention, if I was going to mention aspects of my own career outside of painting. I'm a painter and was educated as a painter. But over the years, have curated a lot of exhibitions and written quite a few things about art, not entirely, but very largely about art by artists of African descent. And why that's important to you is not probably because of my biography, but because of maybe the vantage point of the talk I'm about to give very briefly. And that is, how did that all occur? As I said, I was educated as an artist, but then over the years curated art and began to write things. And that's not unusual of many artists who recognize in principle that the things that they're interested in that are not prevalent or known in the art world, that they would like to see known, so they write about it or they do exhibitions. But perhaps that is an indelible part of artists of African descent, especially African American artists. I mean, there's a long list of well-known African American artists who became historians and curators, sometimes doing all three, beginning with James Porter, Elton Fax, Romare Bearden. Best known of all these days, David Driscoll, Richard Powell, James Harris. I mean, these are all people who, not all of them have remained artists, but have been artists. And most of them have remained artists, and some of them, like Romare Bearden, of course, became very great artists, but also exceptional curators and art writers. And that is because they recognized that they were doing art which could not be received by anyone, perhaps not so much because of its quality, but because of the lack of a national context in which to put it. So, like them, I've done the same over the scope of many, many years. Does this work when I press it? It does work. It's magic. So I said I wanted to talk about using my own work. I'm not going to show you many slides, maybe I think 9, because it's not really so much of a slideshow, but it's by way of trying to talk about certain things that artists of African descent have done and continue to do, which, if not absent entirely from the art scene, is less pronounced or perhaps interpreted in ways other than ways that would give their work unique validity. Often the interpretations are in relation to European contexts and the like, which no matter how good their art, it becomes a footnote to, therefore, to somebody else's history, somebody else's legacy, somebody else's biography. I am a purely intuitive artist. That is to say, I'm not an intellectual artist by any means. When I write things, I try to do that very analytically. But I have long figured out as an artist, I don't have that kind of intelligence. As an artist, I just simply kind of let it hang out. I mean, I do what I want to do. And most often, by the time I finish something, it has no resemblance whatever to what I started out to do. And I kind of look at it somewhat strangely as some kind of curiosity that came out of me, like it came out of my body, but I didn't know really what it was or how it got there. I'm a little bit like an irresponsible parent who goes away for a year and comes back and really isn't sure why his children are following him around, who they are, and what relationship he has to them. And that's kind of the way I look at my paintings. So when I talk about it, it's really what I'm about, the way I'm about to talk about these is not so much about my intention, but my after-the-fact observation of some of the things in them which are related to issues which are common to a lot of artists of African descent. In my case, I was born in Jamaica. I grew up in Jamaica, and I grew up with the whole business of discovery. We always kept, from little kids, we heard stories about how Christopher Columbus came and discovered us. We saw B-rate Spanish movies about the coming of Christopher Columbus, and we would sit around and we would cheer, and we couldn't wait until Christopher Columbus's 3 boats hit the horizon and they came to discover us. I don't think it ever crossed our minds that we weren't there then. And the way most of us came was not exactly the way we would have chosen to come. But the psyche of that is an indelible part, I think, of Caribbean people, and perhaps indeed of not just Caribbean people, but African American people as well. Now, one of the things that's important culturally, is that before the US closed its borders, its immigration borders, somewhere in the early 30s or so, African American people traveled fluidly between the US, Central America, the Caribbean, and so forth. I mean, they went back and forth a lot. And those cultural ties were broken artificially. But the cultural nucleus of the Caribbean, Central America, and South America is very, very pronounced, thank you, very pronounced among African American people. And it's a part of the psyche of much African American art. This painting of mine called In Search of El Dorado takes its name from the Mayan god of fertility. I'm sorry, it doesn't take its name. It's about the Mayan god of fertility, Chocmol, that you see there in the middle of the painting. It's my version of Chocmol. Chocmol doesn't look like that, but it's my version of Chocmol. And what you see, in a sense, is a Spanish galleon kind of invading the bowel, the stomach of Chocmol. And it's almost like, you know, like an image of an invasion of the Americas. And the idea of invasion of the Americas, intrusion of Europeans onto the Americans, is a strong part of the psyche of a lot of African Americans, especially those who are coastal, this side of the country. And I am a very coastal person. I represent that part of the African American image, the coastal part, the aquatic part, the part that interfaces between uses the Atlantic to interface with Europe and the Caribbean. And so you have this sense of invasion and this sense of foreboding. But for me also, I'm what you'd call a wanderer, somebody who goes, in my interpretation of the word, globally, not in the tourist sense, not to discover new things so much as to discover new meanings for what I know, in almost like in the Homeric sense, like the Odyssey. And it's probably no coincidence that probably the major work on that score by someone from the Caribbean is Derek Walcott's a sequence of poems called Homeros, in which he talks about, in his poetry, imagery evolves of himself leaving the Caribbean and going worldwide. It's like taking the particular with you and expanding upon it and making the world yours as a result. But the issue, though, goes wider than that, perhaps. It goes to the basic core of the principle of myth and legend. And myth and legend is a part of what I do, and it's a part of what a lot of African American people and people of African descent do, as I will probably show you, try to show you in some of the works which are about to come. My myth and legend, of course, as I just hearkened and referred back to Greek myth and legend, but perhaps there's a similarity which goes much deeper than that. Which side do I go? This side? Thank you. This work is called Shango's Cargo. Both of them, the one before and this one, by the way, are watercolors. And Shango's Cargo shows a slave ship, and presumably Shango is a spiritual god of the Yoruba people. And Shango's cargo is not only slaves, but ideas that slaves bring with them. I think I'm very conscious of slavery, like so many people, but I realize in looking at my paintings and looking at them, how that manifests itself largely is in the middle passage. It's about the transformation of people from one culture to another. Most of my paintings that refer to slavery tends to be much more about that than the suffering and toil that they incurred while being slaves. It tends to be much more about the cultural transformation of people who were delegated to the subculture of a society. And so you have here Shango's Cargo, which is kind of like a mythical slave ship. And it goes into, it comes about as a kind of awakening, a kind of spiritual awakening of a new world. I was struck recently, a few months ago, seeing a movie, I think it's Pocahontas, in which you have a Spanish ship coming into a harbor, not a harbor, there was no harbor then, but coming into kind of a cove, presumably in North America, to the music of the opening bars of Richard Wagner's Das Rheingold. And I was struck by it because the Wagner image is the creation of the world through the eyes of, or through the music of Wagner, the creation of the world. And I was struck by that because there's a very great similarity in that kind of context of the coming of the Europeans to the New World as there is in mine. Very often I think of it that way, the opening, the beginning of a new world. It's an enlightenment, not a cultural enlightenment in a positive sense, but an enlightenment in the sense that your life is about to change forever. The world is about to change. It's like a new world created that way. And I think that is something that a lot of people I know, why can't I do this right? So, oh, I see what I do. I'll just press next, right? Shango's cargo deals with the issue of a reverse passage. It deals with the issue of African Americans returning to Africa and the idea of the cultural tension. I wanted to do a painting about Charlie Parker. It ended up being about Dizzy Gillespie. It ended up being a lot about music. But it is music which talks about slavery and, in fact, enslaving African people, in a sense. And it's no, you know, people are very conscious of the fact, for example, that Liberia was a state created by ex-slaves. And in a sense, a kind of reverse slavery occurred there. So the issue of slavery among many African American artists is not only simply about what happened here, but actually the psyche of African Americans in general in terms of subjugation. This one is called Crabs in a Pot. And crabs in a pot, of course, is a metaphor for people who are frustrated and they're all in the same situation and they can't get out of it. Well, my crabs in a pot also talks about things such as Egypt and the mythical notion among African Americans and our cultural sense of Egypt being a historic birthplace of African things, one of them. And for many people, that's controversial. For many African Americans going back all through the 20th century, that's been a very important thing, from the Langston Hughes poem called I Have Known Rivers, which goes from the Mississippi to the Nile. And African Americans trace their history that way. But oftentimes it's confused history. Oftentimes it's about ignorance. And ignorance is a very important part of our life. It's a very important part of all art, and it's a very important part of all life. In my own work, I deal with ignorance a lot, because ignorance runs a lot of what we do, perhaps no less so than education. And so this is about that kind of story. I'm getting good at this, just I'm about to close. This one is called Sound the Knell Slowly. And so it's a watercolor. The one before is a large painting, oil painting. Sound the Knell Slowly is religious. It's Christian. It takes place, the tableau is a drum, as you can see, maybe. But it's about an African type of Christianity. And Christianity, as well as Islam, have been ways, or are ways in which one traces the legacy of the African experience. It's one in which one creates what's called these days the African diaspora. Of course, we know, people know diaspora is a Greek word. It was used to describe the scattering of Jews worldwide. But maybe 2-3 decades ago, people of African descent began to use the word. It's become more popular because African people are all over the world. And as such, we trace our legacy, or people trace African legacy, through not only what is written, but through their culture, and especially, in many cases, through religion. This one is called A Path of the Samba, and I was mindful of the conversation this morning about decoration, because this is a very highly dense paintings. I'm really not somebody who makes compositions so much. I kind of let it all hang out, and then I try to figure a way of, somewhat curtailing my excesses, more than creating composition. And this has everything in it but the kitchen sink. And it's really about issues and symbols and things which have come all the way from Africa through Central South America. I often think of the Americas, curiously enough, even though I live and I've always lived in North America, I think culturally and spiritually of Africa in an L shape. Africa across the Atlantic, Central America, down to South America. Interestingly, much more than I think about it going the other way. I'm not sure why that is, but my nucleus tends to be much more Central American in terms of concept, even though I don't live there. I never ever have lived there. This one is called simply Jerusalem. The tableau is a chessboard, and you can see chess pieces there among mosques, synagogues, and churches. And Jerusalem was done not only because of our involvement in the Middle East, which perhaps stimulated it in many ways, but also because the African experience is very much tied up with Jerusalem. Time in the 30s, for example, African-American people who were very affluent would make pilgrimages to Jerusalem. Jerusalem is a very strong place where Christ spent a lot of time, and African-Americans, hearkening back to the Old Testament and to issues of Christ, even before Christianity, focus in on Jerusalem. So the idea of taking Jerusalem was not really a stretch for me. One of the three wise men in the Bible is Jerusalem and the like. Now, having said that, however, I am not particularly a Christian person, but I am really very much fascinated with the idea of Christianity as culture. And this one, the second to last one I'm about to show you, is called Tombstones. And Tombstones is about black and black crime. It's about black self-hatred. It's about black misunderstanding of Africa, black misunderstanding of culture. But nevertheless, all of these things are very strong forces in our society. Interestingly enough, perhaps people who are outside of a culture, outside of a race, cannot easily comment on things within it. I'm not sure people within it like myself can do that easily either, but certainly I can do that without having to defend myself against political correctness and the like. And I think it's a very important thing for me to do, not just for my own pathology, but because it's the experience that I know very well. I lived in Washington and confronted my own mortality on the streets every day, and I wanted to make paintings about that. But it's something that's very prevalent among the works of a lot of people of African descent. And then this one, which is called The Scourge of the Predator. It's really about, I wanted to call it, I thought originally, The Fire Next Time. It's about death, it's about destruction, but in a broader sense, it's about seeing Christianity as a certain kind of pagan ritual, which I often do. I mean, I think in my art I spend a lot of time fighting and cursing God and damning God to hell. And in this I do, and this I know a number of artists do, the idea of God as evil, God as a death figure. Why did he put me in this predicament if he had any sense? Why do I need to pray to God about New Orleans? Is he mentally retarded? Doesn't he know there's a problem in New Orleans? Why does he need a prayer? I mean, this kind of issue is something a lot of people talk about all the time, and it comes through in art. So I think I should stop here, and let's have a chance to talk, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Up there already.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yep. This question is for Gabriel. I saw your installation of America and Americas at the Blanton Museum. And I have to tell you, it was perhaps the most deeply satisfying exhibition experience I've ever had. And partly because of this turning and disrupting and complicating our standard narratives of American art history. But my question is to you, because I had a very odd encounter with one of your docents. And what your docent said to me when I asked for directions to the American Gallery was that she pointed me to the gallery, and then she said, well, you know, it's quite controversial. So I said, well, why is she telling me this, you know, as I'm about to venture forth to the gallery space? And so I'm curious about the reception of the exhibition by both critics, but by your general public, and by your docents. People who do have to talk about the installation in some meaningful way, and how you've gone about doing that. So thank you.
Well, I have to thank you for your very kind comments. You know, the reception, it's funny, I'm trying to think which of our docents you encountered, because we've been working on our docents very, seriously, we've been working very hard on sort of actually renewing and diversifying our docent body. We used to have a very traditionally, affluent, older, certain type of profile, and we have been working very hard, and we take their training very seriously. So it sounds like you got one of the disgruntled previous generation, and that's unfortunate. The reception has been surprisingly seamless. When I started talking about this, people said, you're nuts. There's just no way people are going to complain. The community's going to complain about this. And what I find is that I think most people, particularly in a place like Texas, it's all about hybridity. It's all about, every day. And it's crazy to say it's Texas. It's everywhere. It's all over the world. And people know that cultures are simultaneous, that identity is something that you negotiate, and that it's like having sliding controls. You emphasize one thing or de-emphasize another, that people are mobile. I don't think it's news to anybody. Talking about our most general public, the strongest criticism to the installation has come from the academics. We're part of a university, and particularly the area study. This is totally antithetical to the idea of area studies. In area studies, you sit over here and you look at those people over there. It's a very sort of pseudo-scientific, and you tell them the truth about themselves. And they have to be somewhere else. There has to be a border. There has to be a delimitation of that. So to talk about this codependence and the fact that you can't separate, you can't draw these lines between what's American and what's Latin American, really confuses, for example, people who work in Latin American studies. Literally the head of the Latin American Studies Center said, you're out of your mind. Why are you giving up your wing? You had a whole wing to yourself, which was true. But I was more interested in having that dissolved into a narrative that was a little more complex. So, and the art historians have had a similar response. Most of them didn't come to the opening, and they're still very upset about it. It's a small number. Yeah, I know. I think it's something. And I'm exaggerating. I'll always exaggerate. There have been a lot of people who are from other disciplines, who are very interested in coming to this kind of questioning. So we've been generally very pleased with the reception. And thank you for your comment.
Next question on this side of the room.
I want to thank you for very extraordinary questions that told a lot of interesting truths. And at the risk of generating a laundry list of different cultural, geographic frames through which American art needs to be looked at, it seems to me that the multiple references to Columbus and discovery invite putting Native American identity or indigenous identity on the table in some way in this discussion, particularly because of the fact that Native identity is conflicted in terms of national and cultural location, and so invested in very complicated and diverse notions of sovereignty, which inhere in both cultural and political discussions. And I wanted to sort of offer that observation as important to this kind of discussion, but possibly some of you want to comment. I certainly in the Canadian context, we both have a strong in First Nations movement that wants to distinguish itself from Canada, and then Rebecca Belmore and other Indigenous artists are celebrated as part of what makes Canada's art truly distinctive. So I think that that question may be particularly vexed in Canada.
Yeah, I'd like to make two comments. I was going to bring a slide of the new Canadian $20 bill and put it up against I think it was a $1 bill in Alan Sekula's picture, because it has Bill Reed's Spirit of Haida Gwaii on the back of it, that certainly First Nations culture has now become representative of Canadian culture. And with all of the problems that that entails, certainly Canada has made much more progress on land claims issues with Native peoples, but it certainly hasn't been solved. There's still large numbers of First Nations peoples who live below the poverty level, and there's still a great deal of political agitating going on. The second comment I was thinking about was this new proposal by the U.S. government to have identity cards, if not passports, crossing the borders, and the implications of this for First Nations peoples or Native Americans whose cultures and territories cross borders. That the freer movement, we were talking earlier, or maybe you said the freer movement through at least the North American continent into Mexico, Canada, the U.S., I think prior to probably the 1980s and 90s, when borders began to be much more strictly enforced at the same time as we have NAFTA. This notion of the opening up of borders, but only opening up in particular instances. So I was also talking with Jennifer Roberts about her looking at the transportation or the journey of Copley's painting across the ocean and thinking how much more complicated that journey has become from one country to another. That someone could look at Barnett Newman getting maybe in a car in New York City, getting across that border, getting up to Emma Lake, and the physicality of that journey, and now today trying to get across the border between Canada and the US. And what you'll discover, any of you who've flown into Canada, is that when you fly in, and particularly when you fly out, the US border is in Canada. Mm-hmm. It's in the Canadian airport. If you fly out of Toronto or Calgary or Montreal or Vancouver, you go through customs in Canada, through US Customs. So what does that mean about this border that we're talking about, US and Canada? Very, very complicated, and just as complicated, obviously, in different ways as the US-Mexico border. Henry mentioned he was going to ask me a question about that, and I have a statistic that the almost 4,000-mile Canadian border is patrolled by, at least in 2002, about 600 US border people. The half the length, almost, US-Mexico border is patrolled by 10,000 US border patrol people. So lots of conversations about crossing and not crossing borders, and then the comment that the border we didn't cross the border crossed us.
I wonder if Keith or Gabriel have any comments about representation of First Nations.
This is something that you really should have a much fuller discussion of First Nations. I mean, for example, in the Caribbean, Native people were mostly wiped out, and as they have been in so much of South America. African American people, for example, more slaves went to South America by far than came to the United States. You wouldn't necessarily think that outside of Brazil, but what you've had is mass genocide in many countries. So these are very interesting issues, and they're things that I think we all should, we need to study much more carefully. The business of southern borders is, certainly among people of African descent, is that most people of African descent did not move north, did not come to beyond, out of the South until the 1920s and 1930s with mass immigration for jobs. So the psyche of African American people, probably not people who are 20, but certainly their grandparents, is Southern. And often you'll see people say, you know, I can't make it here, my children can't make it, I'm going to send them to grandma in New Orleans or in Mississippi. The psyche is Southern. And their psyche, and that is much broader than just simply the border. It is part of Cuba. It's part of Haiti. That's why you have people with so many African Americans with so many Haitian names. Toussaint Louverture and the Haitian Revolution was something that Americans participated in, and certainly African people all worldwide took great pride in. And so the move to the north and the acceptance of northern ideas is a relatively new thing. The long historical one for 200 years or more is southern, and southern well beyond the border. If you go to Cuba, I talked to people in Cuba about where their sources of music came from, and I thought they would say Spain or whatever. They say, no, New Orleans, which is very, very interesting.
I'd like to take another question from that side of the room.
Our country should be much more kind and gentle to other countries. I can't give a gift to any country at the moment except Canada. We have a Pledge of Allegiance in this country with a controversial phrase in it, and the debate over whether it's politically correct or religiously correct, but we could say one nation under Canada. That'd be geographically correct.
Is that good or bad?
Well put. Yes.
Hi, Susan Platt again. I have a question to the two Latino scholars. How does Chicano fit in with your frame of reference? I know there's a lot of different issues here, class issues, historical issues, boundary issues, et cetera. But where does that fit in this non-hierarchical observation of the art that you're discussing?
Who are the two Latino scholars?
Well,
I guess I'm one of them. Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, please go ahead.
Okay.
In fact, I think I asked you that question earlier.
Yeah, honestly, I'm not a Latino scholar. I'm a scholar of South American art. And one of the things that happens when you move to this country is people don't know the difference. And so I'm constantly being asked questions about Latino art, but which is something I have a very cursory knowledge of. And there are people who know far more than I do, and institutions that are far better prepared. To me, just read, and I'm grossly oversimplifying just so that Henry can attack me. To me, it's a category of American art. It's an American experience. It's an immigrant experience into this country, which is not shared by people who live in the other countries of Latin America. And one of the issues for the curatorial field has been that because the United States is a center of power, it's a center of discourse, that discourse is taken as a predominant a lot of resentment on both sides, both on the side of Latinos towards Latin Americans, of Latin Americans towards Latinos. It's something that's been analyzed, and it's part of the issue. And the big unspoken term is class, because we're not allowed to talk about class, but it's a very major issue that runs through some of these tensions.
And we'll just take one more question.
I was hoping you would also answer the question.
Well,
and I was very interested in your
yeah.
in your answer, because when you said I'm not a Latino scholar, I'm a scholar of South America, and Chicano is an American art. And yesterday we were creating this big barrier, American art, Chicano art. There was definitely like this wall between these two categories. So you're creating another division, but I would really like to hear from you.
What I was asking Gabriel earlier really was the reception from the Latino community, the Chicano community, specifically in Texas, to the new installation and how Latinos were represented with that installation and how did it work. And having not really seen the exhibit itself, I can certainly see the opportunities for creating dialogue, since the show is all about dialogues between different kinds of cultures and schools and cultural regions. I can certainly see an opportunity for a dialogue even between U.S. Latino production and its counterparts in its country of origins, for example.
So U.S. Latino is the same as Chicano then? Is that the
A Chicano
interpretation we're getting?
is a term for Mexican American. Specifically, it's a politicized term that came about in the 60s. The term Latino and Hispanic are interchangeably used now for U.S. citizens of Latin American heritage, for lack of a better term. But I don't know if we have time for one more question, or we shall. It's actually 10 minutes after the hour.